just checking in out front, so they're just kind of logging people, and we'll get a couple more in. We recognize that it's an interesting week in Washington, so we're sort of seeing that play out as people decide either to be fully distracted by events such as this one, or to just succumb to the other distractions going on around the city. Let me go ahead and begin with some of our security announcements and other things, and then we'll move into the rest of the program. So really would like to welcome all of you here to CSIS. You are in the room for keeping chemical weapons out of the hands of terrorists, the elimination of Libya's remaining chemical stockpile. So if you intended to be in a different meeting, now's your moment, because that's the topic of this session. We start every meeting here at CSIS with our basic security announcement. So I just want to make sure you're aware of our building safety precautions. You have a couple of different exits here and out the front, primarily out the front. If for any reason the loudspeakers start to tell us what to do, we will follow their instructions. Our staff members will lead the way. Chanel, raise your hand. Chanel will help guide to the appropriate exits if for any reason we needed to leave the building. We do feel very secure here, but we take our responsibilities as a convener very seriously, so we just want you to be aware of that. And I am your responsible safety officer for the day. So take a moment, look around to understand where you are, and it'll be easy to respond if we ever needed to. The second important piece of business is just to review the ground rules. Today's meeting is actually on the record. We are live streaming at the CSIS website, so we know we have other participants joining us that way. We'll be live tweeting the event from our CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues, the Pony account. If you want to use hashtag CSIS Live, that will collate. So that is what we're doing. And in addition, the entire session will be available on the website for replay via the YouTube capability. So with some of that administrative task out of the way, let me make a couple of introductions. I'll start with myself. I'm Rebecca Hersman. I am the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and a senior advisor in the International Security Program here at CSIS. And so it's my pleasure to welcome all of you in the audience, but also the tremendous panel of experts that we have today to talk about this rather under-examined issue. And so we're really pleased to be able to do that. So let me take a minute and introduce everyone at the table and then set the scene, and then we will get going into a conversation. All the way to my right, I have Deepti Chaubey, who is the head public affairs branch and the OPCW spokesperson from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. So she has traveled here from The Hague. Thank you very much for doing that. Before joining the OPCW, Deepti was the senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University NITSA School of Advanced International Studies. And she was also a senior policy consultant to the executive secretary of the CTBTO. She's actually served in a number of positions all around the nonproliferation community, to include her work both at the Carnegie Endowment as well as the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So welcome, Deepti. I also have Ambassador Israng, who is the permanent representative of the Federal Republic of Germany to the OPCW. So really brings that perspective from the German Diplomatic Corps and his role in the OPCW here. Prior to this position, Ambassador Israng served for more than 8 years on the Foreign Policy Advisory Team for Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel. He has served in a variety of positions within the headquarters of the Federal Foreign Office, such as the NATO Division and in the Office of the State Secretary, and has worked as foreign policy advisor in the German Bundestag. Then to my left, I have Simon Lamage, who is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Nonproliferation Programs. And in this capacity, he supervises the State Department's nonproliferation programs and advances their efforts collectively toward eliminating and combating the spread of weapons of mass destruction. He previously served as Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher's Chief of Staff and helped to oversee 3 State Department bureaus under her purview when she was Undersecretary. So he also has been actively involved. Going further down to the left, I have Minister Counselor Parello Plesner, who is Minister Counselor and head of the Foreign and Security Policy Team here at the Embassy of Denmark in Washington, D.C. He was previously a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and prior to that, he was Director of a development NGO with activities in Asia and served as Denmark's Senior Advisor on China and Northeast Asia from 2005 to 2009. Finally, to my far left, we have Mallory Stewart, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy, and she's responsible for the management of the Office of Emerging Security Challenges and the Office of Chemical and Biological Weapons Affairs. Mallory joined the State Department as an attorney in the Legal Advisor's Office, where she worked on numerous legal issues related to nonproliferation, sanctions, conventional weapons, weapons of mass destruction, missile defense, and space. She was, in fact, the lead lawyer on the 2013 U.S.-Russia framework for the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons and has been deeply involved in these issues throughout. So we've got a terrific lineup of folks to look at this issue and to talk about a different country from Syria in terms of the chemical weapons challenges of recent years, one that has kind of been somewhat below the radar, but nonetheless a very important tale for the international community and for the effort to eliminate chemical weapons programs across the globe, and that is the story of Libya. I think perhaps I'll just do a quick setup to sort of bring us up to date a little bit on the history of our efforts in Libya to eliminate their chemical weapons program. It's perhaps helpful to think about this as a play in three parts, or in three acts. Act one commences in the 2003-2004 timeframe when Libya, under the former head Gaddafi, decided to declare and disarm of most of its WMD capabilities, nuclear and others, but with particular emphasis for today's discussion on their chemical weapons program. They joined the Chemical Weapons Convention and proceeded to embark on a destruction effort of the fairly large chemical weapons program that they had on Libyan territory at that time. The Libyan declaration included nearly 25 metric tons of bulk sulfur mustard agent, several thousand unloaded aerial munitions, several chemical weapons production facilities, and they began destruction all the way back in 2004. A number of those production facilities were converted. There were a variety of actions taken, and the long-term destruction, which was a more complex effort of eliminating the bulk mustard agent, commenced. As the years went on, there were some additional security and technical challenges. Some of those destruction efforts had sort of slowed down, but they had remained in close coordination and cooperation with the OPCW and the Technical Secretariat. But then, of course, we had in 2011 the eruption of the Arab Spring and the subsequent events that occurred across Libya in terms of the broader violence, the NATO intervention, where there was considerable concern about the safety and security of those residual mustard stockpiles, and then ultimately the fall of Gaddafi. In Act 2, I would say, upon the fall of Gaddafi and the emergence of the new Libyan National Authority, they not only needed to recommence destruction of that remaining mustard agent, but in fact discovered some previously undeclared weaponized chemical agents, which included a little more than 500 chemical artillery shells, 45 chemically filled tubes, and 8 aerial munitions. They declared those, consolidated them also at Ruwaga, and another international effort came into play to bring destruction capability into Libya under quite complicated circumstances to eliminate that Category 1 or Priority 1 set of chemicals quickly. That was accomplished by mid-2014. But nevertheless, there were still quite a significant number of chemical precursors that had been awaiting destruction and had all sort of been placed on hold as the chemical weapons, as the security situation in Libya deteriorated, and concerns about in-country destruction grew with regard to those chemical precursors. So that brings us to the events of kind of the 2015, or later on 2015, 2016, or what we'll say here, Act 3, in terms of the story of destruction and the decision to help Libya truly bring the full elimination of its chemical weapons program over the finish line, and to do so in a very complex and deteriorating security environment, and one where the growing presence of non-state actors and other threatening actors was of increasing and looming concern. So that is probably the best place for me to turn this over to our esteemed panelists. I will do this in the form of questions and answers so we can be dynamic about how we do this. I will make sure we save some time at the end of our conversation for questions from you. But with that bit of a scene setter, Simon, can you sort of take it from here? Can you set the stage for us? Again, as I laid out, we've been steadily working towards the destruction of Libya's stockpile since 2004 in an environment that's been quite turbulent for some time. And most of those agents had been stored there the whole time. All of those priority 2 chemicals had been there. What changed? What made it so much more urgent for the international community to come together and to decide this really needs to be done, and done quickly and differently than the normal pattern of operation?
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'd be remiss if I didn't start off by thanking you and CSIS for organizing this very exciting panel for me, both because I have colleagues and friends on the panel who I greatly respect, who I've been working with for some time, but I'd also like to acknowledge the stakeholders in the community that cares about these issues that's in the room, both international partners that I see, academics, and others. So thank you for being there, and thank you, Rebecca, for providing this opportunity. Also, in your usual modesty, I think we all got to know Rebecca in her role in the Syrian chemical weapons elimination process, where she was one of the leaders who really made that operation succeed. So again, very appropriate to look at a new, more recent operation where the United States and the international community had a strong measure of success. So to answer your question, I'll be happy to say a few words about how Washington, and when I say Washington, I mean the government, the interagency, and our partners, approached this particular problem set, how we assessed the proliferation challenge posed by chemical weapons precursors, and how we use the tools that we have available. Those tools are not always well known, but we have a few, and we've been evolving them for a few years. As you note, all that remained of the Gaddafi-era chemical weapons program in Libya by 2015 were several hundred metric tons of priority 2 chemical weapon precursors stored at a depot outside of Wudan. These were essentially toxic industrial chemicals that could be used to produce chemical weapons agents, but were still several steps removed from being made into actual agents that could be used as weapons. This is indeed one of the several ways in which the situation in Libya was different from that in Syria. The chemical weapons elimination effort in Libya was fundamentally different from the more publicized 2013, 2014 elimination effort in Syria in a number of ways. First, as you mentioned, the complexity and the size of the project, as well as the nature of the chemicals involved, were quite different. In Syria, we were dealing with over 1,200 metric tons of chemical weapons agents and precursors, including nearly 700 metric tons of the most proliferation-sensitive materials known under the Chemical Weapons Convention as Priority 1 chemicals, namely sulfur mustard and a key precursor to the nerve agent sarin. Second, the political context was dramatically different. In Syria, we were dependent on the cooperation of a regime that had used chemical weapons in attacks on its own people, and who had only been motivated to join the Chemical Weapons Convention, as we know, by strong international pressure and President Obama's explicit threat to use military force. In Libya, we were working with the government of national accord, which, despite the many challenges it continues to face and its own capacity limitations, was transparent and demonstrated its commitment and obligation, demonstrated an interest in meeting its commitments and obligations under the convention. This has not only a political relevance, but for the particular programs that some of us manage, a necessary requirement for us to exercise authority to work with a partner, a cooperative partner. These are cooperative programs, indeed. It is also important to observe that the presence of these chemicals was not news to us. Rather, it was the risk environment that had changed. We had been following these materials for some time and had been deeply involved since 2004 in assisting the Libyans to dismantle and eliminate the various elements of its now defunct Gaddafi-era weapons of mass destruction programs in close cooperation with our Department of Energy and Department of Defense colleagues. In fact, various programs at the Department of State, which I can speak to, have been involved with assisting Libya since 2004 with as varied activities as a program to work with Libyan scientists to ensure that they were gainfully employed as their program was eliminated. The department's role, including removing key nuclear infrastructure in 2004, collecting and securing unexpended and abandoned conventional weapons in 2011, and improving security at the chemical weapons storage site in 2012 are a few examples of our engagement with Libya leading up to this. And so when we approached this problem in late 2015, amidst deteriorating security conditions and reports of a growing ISIL presence in the country, particularly in and around Sirte, we had a wealth of expertise and relationships to draw upon in examining potential technical options for removing those chemicals. Relying on experts across our interagency, we examined a range of technical options, including securing the materials in place, destroying them in Libya, and removing and destroying them at a commercial facility outside Libya. The same conversation, as I'm sure we'll hear from Deepti, was also taking place internationally, led by the OPCW. Ultimately, we determined that removal of the precursors in cooperation with our international partners was the right thing to do.
Thank you. I think that sets the scene quite well for what sort of needed to unfold. Mallory, I'd kind of like to turn to you next. So you had to sort of assemble a group of parties at the international level and working with kind of a new coalition. How did that come together? How did that overall operation come together? Who coordinated that? How were some of those decisions made? How were the countries brought on board? What's sort of the process behind that got us to that solution?
Thank you, Rebecca, and I should also thank you and CSIS for hosting this. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues on this panel and also with this very well-informed audience. We approached this with an eye toward the operational, technical, legal, and political coordination necessary in the context of needing to be quiet initially. The Libyan government had identified the problem early in December 2015, and we had been working to figure out what to do about the growing non-state actor threat in the context of the Libyan security environment, but also understanding how we would work closely with the international community and the OPCW. An overriding objective of the U.S. was to be a part of this international effort, to work with our colleagues both on this panel and some are in the audience as well, in many different countries that are members of the OPCW Executive Council, to see how we can address it in a quiet way. Because at the time, the situation was very concerning. There was a growing non-state actor threat and a certain amount, a stockpile of Schedule II chemical weapons in the desert in an unsecured facility. So we were very concerned that we had to move quickly. So we worked with some of the context and learning experience we had from the Syrian process to lay the groundwork for some executive council decisions. We first sort of coordinated with the OPCW and international colleagues, and collectively we managed to come to an understanding that this timing had to be perfect. We did an executive council decision on July 20th. 2 days later, we had a UN Security Council resolution that endorsed and further enabled the operation that we need to coordinate. And then 3 days later, on July 25th, we had a final Executive Council decision to confirm the destruction plan. So it gets a little bit technical, but we needed to have Executive Council approval for the actions that we were going to take because we were strongly considering at the time removal from Libya due to the resource restrictions, the security environment, and while the lawyers debated, as the lawyers will do, the necessity, it was ultimately decided that we also would need to coordinate with the international community and our partners to get a UN Security Council resolution to allow for the removal from the country, because under the Chemical Weapons Convention, that's not allowed. And as we needed in the Syrian context, a UN Security Council resolution, the best path forward seemed to be to get a UN Security Council resolution. So we had to very carefully and quietly organize the political environment, the legal environment, and even our technical capabilities to allow for this process to roll smoothly. Once the Libyan government notified the Executive Council that it had moved the chemicals to the port, then we were able to roll out fairly quickly with the Executive Council decision and the UN Security Council resolution and the following Executive Council decision authorizing the process. If you look at the documents involved, you'll see some similarities, even though it's a very different context than Syria, but some similarities in text and language because we did learn lessons. We did learn certain legal restrictions were necessary to address in the UNSCR, and certainly we were in complete conformity with the Chemical Weapons Convention as to laying the groundwork for the destruction plan and the removal from country. So it required very good coordination, and I think we were able to do it fairly smoothly given the agreement of all the Executive Council members and certainly the UN Security Council to laying the groundwork for a very smooth process to remove it from country.
Thank you very much. Minister Counselor Perello-Plesner, so Denmark has really stepped forward now twice to lead maritime aspects of the chemical weapons or chemical weapons program-related challenges in two very important cases. How does that sort of come together? How does Denmark see its role here? I mean, I note, in fact, it was the same ship, the Ark Futura, that removed the chemicals here, but also removed the chemicals that were ultimately transferred to the U.S. ship out of Syria. An important role, a challenging role, a role that has required a degree of risk in these risky environments to move ships in and out and to undertake that. An interesting role for Denmark. How did that come together? How do you see that going forward? And what have you taken from those experiences?
Thank you, Rebecca. And let me first add my thanks as well to you and CSIS for hosting this. This is great to be up here in this panel and to be together with people where we all work together on this operation. So we haven't seen each other for a while, so I think it's good to be among friends and colleagues. And let me also highlight how much of an international operation it was. We took the leading part on the maritime aspect, as you mentioned, but of course there are also UK, Finnish colleagues, others in different ways on top of the partners up here that were contributing. Then lastly, of course, being here at the embassy, and I've been here 3 years, so we're also here when we cooperated on the Syria mission, and it's as a transatlantic partner, it's of great to be flanked here on both sides by American colleagues, and of course it also, for us at Denmark, is seen in the light of our sort of very strong transatlantic cooperation with the U.S. Then let me turn to sort of quickly the what and the why of this mission. What we did and contributed this time around was, as you mentioned, a civilian ship that went into the Libyan port and got the chemical substances out. We also had a sort of support unit ship in case of any risk to the mission, and then a command staff that sort of led the mission, and then sort of a number of military and civilian support elements from our customs and tax administration and emergency management agency back home. So those were sort of the elements that we put into play, and Then sort of why? I mean, I think your title basically keeping these substances out of the hand of terrorists. We're a small country, but very committed to global governance, to trying to sort of contribute our part globally. So, so the fact that there was this issue at hand, you could see something tangible you could do and be part of this mission by taking a lead on the maritime role. So when we had that contact, particularly here with U.S. partners, this was something that we quickly talked about back home. We then had our parliament that accepted to be reconvened by the government during the summer holiday, and actually they gave it completely full support. We are a multi-party democracy, so of course there are divergent views in parliament normally on a range of issues, but in this case it was actually a sort of completely united parliament that adopted the resolution that authorized the maritime mission, where because of, as I said, with the support unit, there was a sort of minor military element to it as well, apart from the civilian ship, so therefore it needed parliamentary approval. So for us, I mean, it was really, and then of course, as you mentioned and highlighted, we had the experiences from Syria, having done this before, so I think both from our American colleagues and from ourselves, that made us maybe a little bit of a sort of special interest in what's going to be the way this is going to be dealt with this time, and we're therefore maybe also more quick and ready to say, well, I think we can do this again. So and sort of to conclude, for us, this was a way. I mean, there are so many intractable conflicts in the world that we try to contribute to. This was like a small thing, but at least in its own small way, was making the world a little bit of a better place, that these chemical substances out in Libya cannot fall into the hand of terrorists and have been ultimately destroyed by Germany.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Well, that does then bring us over to you, Ambassador Israng. Germany has clearly been a leader on chemical weapons destruction and contributing in the international community throughout, did so on Syria as well and other episodes, but then here also kind of just a very important role, and doing so in close cooperation with the OPCW and under verification. You are in fact leading the longest part of the operation, the actual destruction of the materials, which is still ongoing. How do you see this? What brought you in? How do you sort of see this unfolding, and what are your thoughts for the future of this activity?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thanks to CSIS and Rebecca Hersman for convening this meeting. The Libya operation is a success story, and it's of course nice to explore the deciding factors of this success story. So I'm very happy to be here with you. What has us motivated to play a role in this operation? That was your basic question. First of all, disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control are key priorities of every federal German government in the past decades. And the CWC plays a special role in this arena, as it is the most successful WMD disarmament regime. Also, given our historical role with chemical weapons, we have an additional motivation to be very active in the field of chemical weapons, and that's why Germany is trying to contribute wherever it can to the goal of the OPCW. By the way, Germany is one of 3 countries that has a separate permanent representative in The Hague dedicated only to the OPCW. The other 2 countries that have a separate mission, by the way, are Libya and the US, and I'm happy to see permanent representative, the former permanent representative, Ambassador Mikulak, in the room, in the audience today. We have a very strong cooperation with your colleagues in The Hague as well. And this is also showing that we put a lot of importance to the OPCW. So we try to contribute wherever we can, especially when it comes to the destruction of chemical weapons. We contributed about $400 million to the Russian efforts to get rid of Soviet chemical weapons stockpile. And as you said, so we played a role in the Syrian chemical weapons destruction. Parts of the effluents went to Germany to be destroyed there. And we spent roughly $10 million on this destruction efforts of Syrian chemical weapons. providing finances to the inspections, to the gym, as well as for medicine and protective gear for people on the ground affected by chemical weapons usage in Syria. In Libya, we have been active as well before. This was mentioned before. This is a long ongoing process for the last 10 years and more. So far, Germany has contributed 5 million euro. That's $5.5 million US dollars approximately to destruction efforts in Libya, but also providing gear, providing air transport for inspectors and other things. So it was only natural that we looked into this final phase of what we could do there as well. And we have the experience with the destruction of the Syrian chemical effluents. So there was already a technical agreement with the technical secretariat of the OPCW with our destruction facility that served as a copy also for this destruction effort. We had some experience with the involvement of the local community, which is of course a very delicate thing. And so that's what contributed to the decision in Germany to say we want to play a role in this, and we offered our services to the international community.
Thank you very much. So Deepti, we've heard a lot from sort of the states parties who contributed to this overall effort. But of course it took, I mean, the OPCW needed to help synchronize and work, provide technical expertise, and probably just as importantly, guide the political legal process that enabled that collective action. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about how that worked. How did that coordination and facilitation work? What were the challenges, if any, in the technical secretariat, and how did you see a path through to overcome them?
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and it's good to see so many people here to hear about the success of this operation. My thanks to you also and to CSIS, but for a slightly different reason, and particularly for people who are watching us through the live stream. In contrast to my experience in the nuclear weapons community, civil society around chemical weapons is a bit different. And so it's great to have an example of, really respected think tank that is able to convene in this way and tell the story and to also put analysis around it. So I really appreciate that, and it's good to just be able to show this example for states parties that might be watching, as well as other stakeholders. So to answer your question about the OPCW's role, well, first of all, I want to actually disaggregate for folks what the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is. It is not a unitary actor. There are three different aspects to it. Number one, there is the Conference of the States Parties. That's the 192 currently countries that have obligated themselves to the Chemical Weapons Convention. There's the 41-member Executive Council, which Mallory has referenced. That's the governing body. And then there's the Technical Secretariat, of which I'm a member of, where we are here to support the states parties and provide policy suggestions and also help with the oversight of ensuring implementation of the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention as well as states parties. Yet we use this term OPCW to mean all of those things, some of those things, and it gets lost sometimes. And the reason I think this is important is that when we disaggregate it, we can start to understand why the OPCW is important. And the reason I also say this is that the media sometimes doesn't quite understand this. And if you looked at the early media on the Libya operation, you would hear things like, the UN conducted this operation. Not true. You will hear that we are a UN agency. Also not true. We are an independent, treaty-based organization. The Director General we are independent of the UN. We have a partnership agreement with the UN. We are very happy to work with the UN, but we stand alone. And we are in some ways, as has been, I think, described by the permanent representative very eloquently, we're a closed system as the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that everything we need to do, we can actually do within the boundaries of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So With that, let me just talk about what's kind of special around how the OPCW was able to conduct this operation along with the partner countries and Libya. First of all, looking at the Executive Council, the OPCW is a forum for consultation, particularly with common terms of references. This matters because when there was this urgent concern raised by the Libyans, there was a place where that discussion could take place in terms of a thorough discussion of potential solutions. So there were technical experts meetings, and that really matters for how do you quickly get through this, rather than imagine it was just a coalition of willing countries, but then how do you really kind of organize that and sort your way through it? Whereas here, you have a head start, where you have people who actually understand what's going on, what the potential options are, but they have to still work their way through it. Secondly, in terms of legitimacy of the operation, the international legitimacy of it, that again, there were these decisions that were taken by the Executive Council once there was consensus about a path forward. And those decisions, and as Mallory mentioned, they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. And I'd say at the highest level in terms of what the OPCW was able to do, it was an innovative application of the Chemical Weapons Convention in extraordinary circumstances. This is in what happened in Syria, what happened in Libya. These are atypical. They're not the ordinary things that happen, but there was, I think, innovation that was applied for us to adapt the Chemical Weapons Convention and to make sure that we are still fulfilling the object and purpose of trying to eliminate chemical weapons. In terms of the technical secretariat and the value add that we provided, I would put in a few different categories. Number one, we served as a legal intermediary between Libya and the contributing countries, and this is particularly in the context of two sets of interlocking exchanges of letters, both of which were contingent upon the other party implementing. So this is, for instance, between the Libyans and Denmark. So unless each party implemented the terms, so if one party didn't implement it, then the agreements were void. So that's one way of just managing how to deal with what was a shifting security and political situation in Libya. And I think we should keep in mind that there was a lot of room for trust to be built between the Libyans and the contributing states parties, and the technical secretariat was able to help fill that gap as an intermediary to help manage that. And I think we have to also recognize that for partner countries, they also had to get the approval of their parliaments or whatever their governing structures were to also commit resources to help. And so I think the OPCW helped with making that process a lot easier. There was also, and this is something that we took away from the Syrian operation, for Germany, we were able to do a combined facility agreement as well as an agreed detailed verification plan. That included everything from how would the chemicals be transported from the port in Germany to the facility? What would be the method of destruction? What verification measures would be used? It included the right of Libyan representatives to be present. There were confidentiality and non-disclosure measures. And I think what that helps to underline is that the technical secretariat has longstanding and deep expertise and experience that needed to be applied for every part of this operation to make the best use of the states' parties' contributions and to be able to coordinate that. And what I'll just end with is also that we talk about how this is a removal, transport, and destruction mission. So the Libyans were responsible for removing these materials from where they were stored and making sure that they were safe until Denmark could come and retrieve them. Denmark transported them, and then Germany is responsible for destroying them. We will not, sorry, let me put it in the positive. We will be able to say that this mission has been accomplished once the OPCW can verify that these materials have been eliminated. So in terms of our value add, I mean, there's one of the essential pieces of it. And it is at that point that we will be able to say that Libya, as one of the possessor states, having joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, will have fulfilled its obligation to entirely destroy its chemical weapons program. And that's a big win. And I think this is the reason we're trying to bring attention to what was really just a tremendously successful operation.
Thank you, Deepti. Ambassador Isran, let me just go back to you for a second. You have the unique perspective, I think, of being your country's permanent representative, so you are deeply embedded in sort of these OPCW processes and organizations, but also very much having that national perspective. I think that vantage point is really useful as you look at this experience. Are there ways to institutionalize some of the means and the procedures? Do you think there are some benefits to these ad hoc arrangements? How do you see this working between the states parties and the OPCW and kind of what it says about the future going forward?
Well, thank you. I think it's a bit difficult to institutionalize the whole procedure for three reasons. One reason is that the CWC clearly states that it's not allowed to export any chemical weapons. So this is the basic rule. So to export it for destruction abroad should be an exception, like the exception we had in Syria and Libya. So it's not the typical case. The second point why this shouldn't be institutionalized is that once there might be another situation where we are faced with a similar situation, but it will be only partly similar. Every case will be different. So I think this is difficult to come up with the ready-made recipe to deal with a certain situation. So this also calls for an ad hoc arrangement. And the third thing, and then I'm only talking for Germany, but maybe our Danish colleague will agree to that. Of course, this is an international effort, and so when there is a similar situation arising, we expect the international community as a whole to look at the situation and not just to look to Denmark and Germany for repeating what they have done before. So this is the other reason why I think we should look at others. Also, what made this a particular success, I think there were three basic success factors of this operation. One thing was the national and regional ownership of the objective of getting Libyan chemical weapons destroyed. The Libyans themselves really want to get rid of their chemical weapons, and that's also maybe one of the differences with Syria, where you could question that. And also the African neighbors shared this objective, and this was important not only for the terms of cooperation with the Libyan authorities, but also for the political backup in difficult, challenging times. The second success factor was, of course, the spirit of cooperation among those who actually did this. This refers to the political level. There was tremendous leadership from the U.S. Side. U.S. Ambassador Ward played a crucial role to put together the donor architecture in The Hague with international partners. There was a great spirit of cooperation, very pragmatic, and also those people that actually did the job on the ground. I mean, for example, the Danish captain of the ship did a great job, Captain Mikkelsen, but also, for example, our desk officer in the Ministry of Defense in Germany, who had to deal with all these kind of bureaucratic troubles with local authorities in Germany. And there were many, I can assure you, being a federal state. And he always concluded his emails when he talked about new problems, saying, in the end, we will win. And this was the right attitude, very pragmatic, problem-solving attitude to bring this to a success. And the last success factor was, of course, the TS, who had shown exceptional organizational skills to put together this whole operation and to be flexible at the same time. So this was very helpful under the leadership of the Director General.
That's great. And I think it is really important to recognize that at the end of the day, when something actually happens, there's real people who actually do it at the working level. It's sort of we often forget about that. Things just, we kind of treat it like a political science experiment, but these are not political experiments. They are actual activities with real people who do real things and who take on, in many cases, real risks. And I think it is important to remind them of, remind the international community of what's involved when people do that. So speaking of some of those risks and challenges and obstacles, it really sounds like such a big win right now, Simon, but it couldn't have been that smooth. I'm confident there were hiccups along the road. What were some of those, and how did we sort of find a way through that?
Thank you, Rebecca, and I think you've heard allusion to some of them along the way, and certainly because there were so many stakeholders within your own systems, you had your own challenges, and I'll just speak to a few that we observed within the U.S. interagency as we were trying to understand the U.S. role, which wasn't completely clear in the beginning. One of the most immediate and obvious limitations was our lack of presence on the ground, working with Libyans on this particular problem in the at the outset. So some of the questions that we had as we decided to become involved were to better understand the capabilities that the Libyans themselves had. Could they move material from Wadan to the port at Misrata? Could they be relied on to do this? Did they need help in the particular governance-challenged environment that they were in? Did they own security at the storage site? Did they own security at the port of Misrata? Were these things we could just assume when we decided to make international commitments and engage our partners? And I dare say we spent several weeks trying to understand some of those effects. The other piece was getting a better sense of our Libyan partners. This was perhaps a bit of a sideshow, but when you partner with someone, you need to understand who they are. Do they speak for their government? And I think many of us can share some of the stories where we were interacting with the long-lasting Libyan envoy in The Hague who had come to us with this request, and there were some very basic questions about his credentials and our ability to make commitments with him. And Ambassador Mikulak and Ambassador Ward, who's not here, could speak a little bit to that, and certainly Mallory, who worked with him closely. We also needed to understand who was in charge on the Libyan side, and that was something that we worked on for some time. And then as the operation would start, this was not sort of a fire and forget situation. We wanted to maintain close eyes on the operation from the start to the finish. And again, with no presence in country and certainly not near the site, how could we guarantee the success of the operation? When the Libyans first came to the OPCW and we engaged them, and I think Mallory can talk a little bit about that engagement as well, they made it clear that they had a strong preference for complete destruction outside of Libya and requested assistance through the OPCW for removal and destruction of the chemicals. But some of the lessons that they drew from the Syria operation is that we were going to do the same thing that we did in Syria. So while we had this well understood and very necessary reservoir of goodwill and experience from the Syrian operation, unfortunately, there was a sense that we would simply repeat that in this case, and that DITRA would provide capability, and that DOD would have the resources immediately available to help. And so in this particular case, we had a number of interagency conversations to understand what would be the lowest cost, most effective way of conducting elimination of these Category 2 chemicals. We were, I think, pleasantly surprised by the very strong interest that our international partners had in providing not just political support, but real capabilities, and we've heard about some of those here. They began to volunteer capabilities in destruction facilities, and it quickly became clear that the best value the United States could bring to the table in this environment was providing readily accessible resources to fund portions of this work, as well as, in a limited fashion, provide advice and limited coordination as needed, whether it be on technical engagement with the Libyans, interacting with them at a political level, working with the OPCW, and then certainly working with our international partners. I'll also mention that, like in the Syrian context, we stayed very close to our congressional appropriators and authorizers, letting them know what we were doing with some of the tools that we had available. I obviously can be expected to say that I'm proud that one of the U.S. government's most versatile nonproliferation programmatic tools, housed within the State Department's Nonproliferation Bureau, was brought to bear. Created in 1994, the Nonproliferation Disarmament Fund has the explicit aim of providing a means for completing urgent, high-priority nonproliferation projects of this sort. It has notwithstanding authority and know your money, meaning that money can be brought to bear in the most dire circumstances fairly quickly. NDF had played a crucial role in removing the key nuclear infrastructure from Libya in 2004 and had funded work to assess and upgrade security of higher priority chemical materials previously stored at the Wadan site in 2012, 2013, and had partnered closely at the time with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that had come in to eliminate, for example, the chemical weapons-filled artillery shells in a mobile system at the time. So we had that history of being a rapid reaction elimination capability that could tie in to the work of other agencies. We were able to quickly commit funds where they were most needed. For example, making the initial financial contribution to the OPCW trust fund that was pulled together, agreeing to cover the cost of the Danish cargo ship and port fees, and finally providing funds towards a portion of the destruction effort at the Gecke facility in Germany. We estimate, out of curiosity, comparing the scales of both operations, that once invoices and financial commitments are paid, we will have been able to complete all of the work that I've described for approximately $2.5 million, supporting the transportation and destruction efforts, plus another $750,000 in contingency planning costs. In addition to the countries represented by the panel sitting here, who provided significant in-kind contributions, other international partners who kept a low profile also were helpful. So the challenges, I think there's a basket of challenges that had to do with coordination and partnering with our Libyan friends. A challenge that I think was overcome as we discovered how quickly they were able to move. Literally, the travel to the port lasted under a day, and then storage didn't have to last very long. So we were very pleasantly surprised at how committed and effective they were. Another basket of challenges had to do with international coordination, but as I mentioned, we were able to draw upon real relationships that had been created during Syria. And then the third was the unknowns and the risks that Rebecca mentioned, which had to do with not knowing ISIL's intent, knowing proximity to the site, and having some challenges in being able to observe the operation in real time. I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Well, let me just sort of reorient us from here just a bit before we kind of open up to broader questions. But, you know, I think we do need to reflect a little bit on what are the implications of this going forward. Where do we draw those positive lessons? Where are there other opportunities to engage successfully? And I think this can go a few ways, both in terms of kind of what are the results and outcomes, and how does that help, what does that say for the broader nonproliferation community and the value of our regimes and norms and others as we kind of look more broadly. Also in terms of any future activities, it's, you know, it was a pretty complex process, a lot of detailed legal hoops to go through, as I think both you, Mallory, and you, Ambassador, referred to. We haven't eliminated fully the challenges of chemical weapons, especially in the Middle East. We can turn to the Syria question, but I think also other types of capabilities that could emerge, perhaps in smaller scale or requiring faster action, where we might not have time for the type of deliberate process that unfolded here. So kind of as you look ahead, how do we build on these successes, but also have the flexibility to respond to situations as they may occur with a degree of urgency, and how do we sort of carry this success and allow it to at least provide that positive energy going forward to other problems? Mallory, I'll start with you and then go to Jonas and down the table, if we may.
Thank you. I think it's actually important to figure out what worked in this context, and certainly a comparison between Libya and Syria is, I think, necessitated when you see a country such as Libya in a similarly difficult situation with non-state actors, with various militia operating, with a difficult and diverse governing structures going on. The country maintained its complete transparency with respect to its chemical weapon program. It provided as much information as was asked from it by the OPCW. It went out of its way to keep the international community fully informed as to where the chemicals were, how secure they were, and when they would move to the port. There was complete coordination and really excellent cooperation between the Libyan government and the OPCW and the international community to make sure that everyone knew at all times where the chemicals were and what their status was. And that's very different than the situation that we have in Syria. In a difficult situation that both Libya and Syria are experiencing, Libya was able to work with various different militias, various different government structures, to make sure that there was a confidence level in the international community and a comfort level in the OPCW that there was transparency and the necessary goodwill to get this process going. Because there is a certain amount of trust you have to have with your international partners, and certainly with the country that is moving chemicals, either within their own country or the country that is moving them elsewhere for destruction. You need to have a certain amount of trust that there's going to be sufficiently accurate information at all times, so that when you arrive to pick up the chemicals in a very dangerous environment, the chemicals will be in the state that they're supposed to be, with the necessary components involved. There will be sufficient security so that things can get done. I think that Libya highlights what the good behavior would be for complete transparency and complete coordination and information sharing. And, you know, as Deepti pointed to, and I think all of us are really aware, working within a treaty structure is sometimes difficult because you have set legal restrictions, and they don't always accommodate every single fact pattern that could come up in the future. And that's why you need such a strong basis of trust to move beyond necessary treaty restrictions with the agreement of the international community, and use that agreement to flexibly interpret and to actually stay within the parameters of treaty and legal structures to do something a little bit more novel. So again, we had some precedent from Syria, but it was the precedent helped us with some of the legal parameters, but I think, you know, what was really most valuable was the complete openness, transparency, and cooperation that was provided by Libya to enable the donors and truly the brave members of the international community that actually went into country, removed it, and then brought it into their own country in the face of, as Ambassador Israng pointed out, some very difficult legal restrictions. And so I can't say enough about the capacity of Libya in a very difficult situation to provide the trust, transparency, and openness that was necessary to make this a success. So I think that's something that is crucial. If you want to work in novel and flexible environments, you need to have good interlocutors, you need to have trustworthy treaty partners, and, you know, with the international community's effort collectively, I think we can you know, flexibly interpret and actually aptly apply treaty restrictions in a novel environment.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, I actually really want to add my voice to what Mallory's just been saying. I think for us also, both at the embassy but back home in Copenhagen and our command structure on the ship, it was really such an integrated sort of enterprise with all our partners, and also sort of the level of details just we had, sort of email. So it was really like an integrated structure, all of us working on one objective, all the way down to just having sort of the right email distribution that I know here with the US being a big partner, a lot hinges on interagency and how that works out, but this was also almost done sort of interagency among international partners, from coordinating our press statements to the operation while it was unfolding. So I think that's really, once again, an important element to highlight on the success part of it. On the challenges, I think I would add to it, maybe there wasn't but just to give a little bit of insight also to the machine room, the question of when to go public on some of these. I mean, since we had a parliamentary process in Denmark because of those a minor military element to it, that of course made part of it public already in August. I mean, I think some of those were discussions both among the partners here with the Libyan government, when would some of these things be public. There were also questions of operational security, so the date was sort of kept on close hold. I think those were some of the things, looking back, that I don't know if we could have found any sort of different solutions, but when we looked at lessons learned, at least they were some of the ones we were saying here. There are some things we had all the time to work with with so many moving parts. My German colleague also highlighted their sensitivities, being a federal government and the local element. When could you announce that you were doing the destruction? And so getting all these from the different countries to play together, I think we managed really well. But while we were doing it, sometimes that demanded a little bit of tight coordination.
Deepti, why don't I turn it over to you? A kind of same basic question. What are some of the takeaways? But I think also if you could touch on this issue of what happens if we need a degree of urgency. Do you think we have some paths to do that? Because I could picture scenarios where time might not be on our hands or quantities might be smaller and we would need the support to kind of resolve an issue. How, are there some ways we might be able to do that, or is it sort of outside of the structure?
Well, let me first, let me touch on something that Jonas said, which is about this thing around managing information and the coordination aspect. That was actually my role from the TS, was trying to help with strategic communications coordination. And I very much enjoyed working with all the states parties involved, and it was actually very challenging because we have different objectives for some of our partner countries around what they're trying to communicate at different times, what considerations are in terms of their domestic publics, and therefore what needed to be communicated when. And we also had a total curveball happen, which is when, we had all agreed to a certain date, and then it was, and this was not through our direct interlocutors with the Libyans, but someone else who basically had revealed, I think they brought like camera crews, and all of this information goes public. And I'm pretty sure that ruined one of my weekends trying to manage for that. But it was, how do you still get everybody on the same page? And, how do you do some common messaging around that? And thankfully, again, everybody who's part of the core group, very reasonable, trying to work things out, trying to help manage all of that. And I think, again, a core part of, just in terms of one of the hiccups, I thought I would add a little bit of color to that. But also at the end of the day, it did get resolved. And you have to just manage for those things. In terms of, degree of urgency, I mean, I think this was one of those things, and I would say that actually we did act fairly swiftly. So I'm going to a little bit kind of challenge the premise of the question. Yes, the Libyans first raised this in December of 2015. There was a set of technical meetings that happened in the first quarter of the year, but as things were resolved, it moved fairly quickly. And in fact, there was the direction provided to the Director General representing the Technical Secretariat to start determining the detailed plans so that everything was ready to go. And then it was a matter of then managing the complexity of some of our key partners' domestic processes to get their approvals. That happened pretty quickly. So I think that that's what we're thinking about. And when I think about who's remaining in terms of possessor states, I don't know that we would have similar situations, like that. Or we also already have those, this kind of precedent in place. So I would think, if anything, that this would become like a more familiar process. Again, we also don't use precedent. It actually says in these executive council decisions that this is not the basis of precedent. But also to your other point that you asked us to address, which is like, what were the results of this? Just at a top level, I mean, this is an operation that involved Libya, the OPCW, and then over 10 partner countries. And I think for people who look at the situation in Syria, they look at the rise of non-state actors who are using chemical weapons, that this is not theoretical, it is real, that was part of the urgency and issues around Libya and the rationale for action. I think we should take hope in that countries can work together within an international organization and be successful. This was not an incremental win. This is a really big win. And I think that people, the public, the media, other stakeholders feel discouraged nowadays about, well, what's happening in the UN, what's happening in the Security Council. I mean, pick whatever your international organization is. And I think it's important, again, most people don't know what the OPCW is, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, but this is a success story, and it's a meaningful one. And I'd also say that, the chemical agents, these precursors, the Libyans had it for the sole purpose, when they had an active chemical weapons program, to make them into sulfur mustard and nerve agent. Those chemical materials will now never be made into chemical weapons. Full stop. That is a big deal. And even though these materials are also industrial chemicals that are traded on the open market, these specific materials, there are about 515 metric tons of it, that's what their sole purpose was. And it's under the convention that we have this pathway to fully eliminating them in a verified way. So I just wanted to say that, that's what was important. And also from the OPCW, from the way in which we did it, we also ensured a holistic approach to it, that it was done safely and securely, with making sure that environmental considerations were taken care of. You don't just dump it into the sea, you don't burn it in an open pit. Like, there are very specific things that the convention requires. So I just wanted to make sure that that was understood. This is a big deal, and we should be mindful of it.
Great. Well, I want to give us a chance to bring other people into the conversation. We have some microphones in the back. If any of you have a question, please just raise your hand. And also, please announce your name and affiliation and your brief question. We've got one here, so Chanel's bringing the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Albert Wolf. I work for Congressman Steve Shapett on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm only here in a personal capacity. First, thank you for putting this on. This is a great talk. I had a couple of questions about this, and the first was about Dr. Stewart. You mentioned that Libya was able to maintain a really remarkable level of transparency, and yet, by all accounts, I mean, Libya is a failed state. How were they able to do this, in your judgment? And then my second question is tangential to what we're talking about, but Dr. Chobe, you mentioned that chemical weapons are obviously a very real concern. We worry about them falling into the hands of terrorists. I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on the idea of moving toward, what happens after chemical weapons fall into the hands of a terrorist organization. Like, there was a report earlier this month that ISIS had attempted to fire shells with mustard gas in them. It wasn't successful. But what about moving towards some sort of a deterrence posture, whether you think that's possible and what it would look like? Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for your question. It is quite remarkable that a government in such turmoil was able to maintain a conversation, a very coherent and informative conversation with us. In fact, one of the reasons we were able to go forward with the international community very closely and actually plan was that every time Libya gave us information about what they had and where it was accurate. And when we went back with additional questions, there was just a recent, very fulsome report by the OPCW addressing the differences in amounts of chemicals actually at the Waddan facility, because due to evaporation or other environmental issues, there was a difference in the amounts. And Libya was completely open and answered questions very quickly and as fulsomely as possible, and then followed up if there were any continuing questions on the part of the OPCW. A large credit goes to Dr. Jibril in The Hague, the Libyan permanent representative there, because he would get us answers in the middle of the night. He would go out of his way to get the very highest members of his government to approve processes and to get things going. And when they told us that the chemicals were on the move to the port, and it was very, secretive, we were very concerned it needed to happen very quickly, they kept us informed throughout the entire, almost day-long process as to the status of the transport. And this is just a very marked difference from the experience that we have with the Syrian government right now. And I think it's something to note. You have one example of a country in turmoil able to go out of its way to try to answer questions, and another example of a country in turmoil that does not answer questions. I can't say enough for the amazement we had when the chemicals were moved to the port in a fully coherent and open way, in the sense that we knew where they were at all times. And we were able to work with the international community and the OPCW to, essentially know how much was at the port, when it was going to arrive, and how it was going to be protected. And then, thankfully for the international colleagues on this panel, the Libyans also went out of their way to work with the coordination required with the ship coming in, and certainly with the destruction capacity. So, I think it was just a very different approach to the questions being asked to Libya. The approach was go out of your way to answer, as quickly and certainly as honestly as possible. And there were questions, and there will be, when these chemicals were decanted, there were problems, and we immediately got that information. We had to sample the chemicals to make sure, under the OPCW, you need to know exactly what these are, and it helped, the colleagues, especially Germany, to be able to receive the chemicals, to know exactly what they were. And Libya went out of its way to work with the international community to thankfully get samples out, and a facility in England was able to sample them. And that just an example of, you deal with the problems, but you completely address them in a very transparent way. And that is a difference that we're seeing between the two players that we've dealt with recently on this particular instance. So.
Mallory, I'll add just one thing on that, because I think it was true, and it speaks also to the difference. Certainly was true from 2011 to 2014. The depth of Libya's strategic decision to be, I don't want to be a chemical weapons state, was profound. It was vertical, it was horizontal. So even as the state is descending into conflict on 1,000 other issues, on this one issue, I think there was really no internal debate, right? So the question of fractious authority was played out kind of operationally, but not in terms of commitment. And that is a huge difference that I think, we can think about when we look at these strategic decisions in the future. I think there was a second question. We want to touch on that, and then we'll get to the next person in the audience. Remind us again. I know we kind of went. The deterrence question. Okay, this sort of how do we sort of keep things? How do we keep progress in terms of keeping it out of the hands of terrorists? Is that right?
Well, basically, first of all, there's been a number of things written. Matt Crane, Eric Bell, Robert Traeger have all said we can deter terrorists. Now, it wasn't specifically written about chemical weapons or nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. But first, I'd like to know, what everyone on the panel thinks about this idea, and second, just briefly, what a deterrent doctrine would actually look like. Thank you.
Okay, so that's going to be a big question for those of you who want to kind of jump in on that a bit. You want to tackle that, Simon? And
Did you want to speak first?
you want to,
Why don't you speak first?
I'm not going to satisfy you because I won't get into necessarily the deterrence piece, but I think it is, I want to, since from your particular professional perch, I think it is incredibly valuable for us to remind ourselves that the tools we had available in this particular mission didn't just happen overnight, because they were well resourced by our congressional appropriators and authorizers who care deeply in a bipartisan way about the United States having programmatic assistance available to do this kind of work. And so before you get to a scenario where a terrorist has chemical weapons capability, we work in a world where the State Department, the Department of Defense, and a number of agencies represented in the room, including DHS and others, have global engagement programs to build capacity to detect, prevent, and respond to that particular risk, which you put your finger on, which is terrorists acquiring chemical weapons or biological or nuclear or dirty bombs, et cetera. And so in the region that we've talked about, whether it's our Libyan colleagues or whether if you move towards the Levant region, we have active assistance programs in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Iraq. The State Department, for example, has a chemical security program where we work with industry to make sure that they follow international guidelines and regulations to prevent toxic materials from falling into the wrong hands or being misused. We also work with the ministries that provide security at the borders. We have an active border security program at the State Department, and as does DITRA and their proliferation prevention program. My colleague in her former capacity as the deputy at the Department of Defense who focused on these issues, and I traveled to Iraq, to Turkey, and to other countries to help ensure that the arc or the threat was pushed away as far from U.S. shores as possible. But again, that only happens with consistent investment in these kinds of programs. We, of course, track very closely the ISIL's ability to develop a capability on the chemical or potentially biological side. Can't, of course, get into that too much. We also don't necessarily have all the agencies that represent the full U.S. toolkit that can be brought to bear in the way that I assume you're thinking of. But I think you've read in the open press about successful strikes against elements of the chemical weapons cadre in ISIL, and we continue to coordinate and to see this problem as a whole a government problem. So that's at least from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, if I may add to this, I think the entire OPCW family is well aware of this major threat posed by non-state actors. Actually, several years ago, the OPCW established an open-ended working group dealing with non-state actors and trying to find ways to counter the threat. Germany and the U.S. are among those states parties that have come forward with a draft decision, which is a draft resolution that summarizes steps that the OPCW family as a whole could take. It's also important to note that while the CWC is signed by states parties, it also addresses and includes threats by non-state actors, because it forces every member state to implement national legislation ensuring that toxic chemicals do not fall into the wrong hands. Some months ago, we added another initiative calling on the responsibility on individuals, establishing ethical guidelines for chemical practitioners throughout the world. Of course, this will not force anyone away from doing bad things with chemistry, but it's another step to appeal to the individual responsibility of chemical practitioners.
Do you have a quick one on this, or?
The only thing I'll say is that on the national implementation measures that are required by the CWC, there's still, I think, 36% of states parties have yet to fully take those steps, and this is the call for them to do that. So if we are going to fully take up our responsibilities for addressing this very real threat, that is the number one thing that they can do. And a lot of assistance is provided by the Technical Secretariat to make that process easier.
Paul Schultz from the UK, and in another sense, the Carnegie Endowment. Three quick questions. First of all, it's an impressive, reassuring story, and that it's all good, but does it tell us anything about the hard cases of a reluctant host state with P5 support and a P5 dispute about evidence and action? Does this tell us about that really difficult compliance and enforcement scenario? It might not. Secondly, how did the informal coalition of the willing emerge in this? What drove it? Was it a sense of geopolitical vulnerability or technical comparative advantage? Is there a sort of coalition of the usual clean-up suspects which has emerged informally but will be important in future cases? And can it be changed? Is it the best coalition? Could it be widened? Finally, you talk about the Libyans, and I assume you mean the government of national accord, which is conveniently UN recognized, and it has access to the port of Misrata. But what would happen if you discovered, or that it was disclosed, that there was a cache of chemical-related substances in the east, in the areas controlled by the House of Representatives and General Haftar, who may equally want to get rid of this stuff, but are not diplomatically recognized? What would happen then?
Those are actually three outstanding questions, none of which is exactly easy. So on the first one, anyone want to sort of jump in there? Go ahead, Mel, or Jonas?
I mean, I think it does have that positive effect with this success story, that it leads for the difficult cases, you've set a precedent. I mean, so in that sense, that's what I think it can be used to as sort of one of the sort of, that you've actually shown that this is the way responsible states should act, and there's an international will to do it. So it does make, when you have other cases, I mean, with more recalcitrance, you can say, you can actually use this as a sort of leverage to point to, of saying this is how things should work out. So in that sense, I think it will hopefully have a sort of positive spillover effect. My little 2 cents on sort of the usual gang, I mean, yes, I mean, in the sense that we were there last time on the Syria, so I think we were both on our own volition, and our American partners were probably also among sort of the first that were asked, would you be able to do this again? But on the other hand, other cases could be very different. It would not necessarily mean a maritime role, which is the one that we had sort of led. So we're just one little piece in that jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jonas that there were sort of the players that we were familiar with in the past and that were asked again, but I think a large credit goes to the OPCW community, because it was really able to quickly pull from relevant capacities and knowledge and resources to coordinate in a more effective way. I think one of the lessons learned, in addition to the very good point that we now see what good behavior is with respect to transparency versus not good behavior, but one of the lessons learned is that this community can adopt and address a non-state actor threat that is quite urgent and needs to be responded to immediately. I think to Deepti's point about implementing domestic laws to cover the CWC requirements, that's crucial. In the same sense, the OPCW provided the forum to quickly mobilize the community to address an upcoming and urgent threat in a fairly novel way. I mean, we had the Syrian precedent, but this also had novel elements unique to Libya. So that was really one of the lessons from this, is that there is a capacity with both the open-ended working group on non-state actors and also the community involved in the OPCW that provided for a quick, urgent, and comprehensive response.
Just one quick on the first question. I just think one distinct positive there is that it debunks the excuses, the operational and security-based excuses that a country like Syria has consistently put forward for why they can't do this or can't do that. Well, the reality is they can, because it was very clear in the case of Libya, where they recognized that they had the political will to do it, they were able to get through some other barriers. So I think it does actually then point the camera straight at the political will question. And that at least puts the kind of the focus right where it belongs in terms of a recalcitrant or not fully willing to be compliant party, and as in the case of Syria. So I think that's a really important distinction. Ambassador Israel wanted to jump in partly on the second question.
Just on the second question, how did this group emerge that actually took on the job? At the beginning of this process, the Director General convened meetings of interested states parties, including all regional groups of the OPCW. So there were African countries represented, Eastern European countries represented, Asian countries. But in the end, it turned out that only one regional group had concrete offers by members of the group, the group of the Western countries, that provided specific parts of the whole operation. And of course, we don't want to become the typical cleanup suspect, as you said. I think we should make an effort to enlarge the group in a similar case. But we have to be realistic that, as we found here, other groups were approached, but in the end, it was just a specific group that actually did the job.
Just 2 quick points. Perhaps we've presented this a little too positively. When you you contrast the hard cases from perhaps something similar, I'd say there were 3 things operationally that were incredibly difficult. The GNA did not actually control the port at Misrata. It had a tenuous hold. It was actually controlled by a militia. It's a smuggling port. It was a challenge to operate there. Second of all, Wadan is near a very big smuggling route, and so there are a lot of different actors in the region, and again, we didn't have a presence on the ground, so we had constant concern with the types of actors, militia groups, and opposing forces that might be there. And then last, there was this constant need to make sure that we weren't drawing attention to the operation at a time when ISIL was nearby, but not necessarily about to fall on the position. And so we did not want, we worried a lot about a truck going off the road, a wheel falling off, an accident, perhaps one of us unfortunately saying something publicly, and that in fact would tell ISIL, look, there's something that the international community values and is worried about, and let's go get it, whether or not they could use it and turn it into something very dangerous. So I think, again, there are some lessons, and nothing will be perfectly applicable to the next scenario if there is one, but I'd venture that there was a few useful lessons learned.
Great. Deepti, I had the sense you wanted to jump in on that. I'll just flag, we didn't answer the third question, which actually is a form of the question that I put to you all, which is if you have an emerging situation, such as, for example, an unknown or unidentified cache, such as what happened in the 2011 timeframe, that could happen in a variety of settings. It's not inconceivable in border areas of Iraq or in other territories where something could happen, or perhaps something that was not properly declared elsewhere. Just as that is as the scenario, given this non-state actor environment, do you think we have some mechanisms to look at that type of problem? Do you want to tackle that one, or do you want me to send that one down here to these guys?
I really feel like that needs to go to one of the folks who has a legal background. And
so I can maybe send that part
Right.
to answer Paul's question to Mallory
Yeah.
and jump in on the rest. And then I want to make sure we get the question back here. So before you answer, we'll get our next question and then we'll roll it up, okay? Go ahead.
Paul, the only thing, and good to see you, but the only thing I would say to, your first question is, it was these states parties who provided these initial answers. And I think that's important because, this next April, we're marking the 20 years of the Chemical Weapons Convention coming into force, as well as, and at the same moment, was the birth of the OPCW. And there's a lot of progress that we can mark for this. This, as Ambassador Strong said, this is the most successful disarmament treaty that eliminates an entire class of WMD, but also we talk a lot about this global norm against chemical weapons. And I'd say it's a very multifaceted global norm because it's comprehensive in its prohibition on use, development, production, stockpiling, transfer. There's strength in numbers in that we have a near universal membership. We're short of 4 countries. And here's the key part of it. Shoring up and strengthening and protecting that global norm requires action by states parties. So that we had states parties here talking about what is the difference between the scenario you posed, I think is important. But you have a certain selection here. And I think that, and one of the reasons I think we are talking about this success story in Libya is that it's instructive. What do other states parties think about the amount of effort that they have put in the last 2 decades of building this extremely successful regime? I think whether you're a possessor state or not, and particularly with the rise of the non-state actor threat, everybody has an equity in ensuring that this regime remains strong and is not hollowed out. So I'm hoping that they are learning that, in fact, this is an effective regime. States parties can provide assistance in ensuring all states are in good standing. And in fact, I think the CWC at its core is provides remedial measures to help states. You can't kick a state out of the CWC. So if you have made a mistake or something that is challenging to the object and purpose, there are these measures that are all about bringing you back into good standing. So I think that this is what states parties more broadly need to reflect on, and I think Libya should give them something to think about in terms of what a path forward is.
I know we had a question in the back.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Alexei Fomenko, Second Secretary at the Russian Embassy here. I'd like to go back to a comment on the discrepancy in the number of chemicals stored at the facility and the amount actually shipped away. I understand it was around several hundred tons. And as far as I know, no one actually went back to the facility to verify that indeed they had simply evaporated on and that they're not in possession of some other group. Don't you think this approach is a bit too lighthearted, especially given the emphasis on verification that was evident in today's panel? Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for your question. So we have actually answered this in response to some queries from the media where Libya has had many inspections, and over those inspections, OPCW inspectors had noted that there was corrosion in the tanks that were containing these chemicals, because some of them were highly corrosive chemicals, and they had actually noted that there were these decreasing levels in these tanks. The analysis that was done, particularly because when the decanting process occurred, that this discrepancy was then quantified, the analysis that was then done using technical and scientific approaches to create, to understand what had reasonably happened, is that both the environmental conditions plus the conditions of these corroded tanks essentially accounted for that discrepancy. So from what was thought to have been the 700 metric tons had essentially become 515 metric tons, and that it could be a reasonable person could understand that it had been due to both the environmental conditions plus the seepage due to the corroded tanks. And actually, it's thanks to Canada as well as the United States who provided the new tanks that we were able to decant, the Libyans were able to decant the chemicals into these ISO certified tanks that were then safe and securely delivered. But there has been an explanation that's been provided to states parties in the Executive Council, and then provided by me to the media on what has happened with that. Oh, and I'll just say this, sorry. It would have been very difficult. You would need very specialized equipment, I think, to siphon off from these containers these chemicals. Again, they're highly corrosive.
Thank you very much. My name is Janne Jokinen. I'm from the Embassy of Finland. And my thanks also to CSIS and to the panel for bringing attention to a very, very important issue and a good story, success story. I had, well, first of all, also thanks to my Danish colleague for mentioning Finland, we did have 2 experts participate in the planning and execution of the operation, and also donated €500,000 for the funding. My question, we have been talking about governments here, of course, being governments, representatives and experts. What of the role of the private sector that is actually quite crucial in these operations and also in the greater scheme of things when we think about the future, emerging threats, technological development, and the development of safeguards? Thank you.
Well, our destruction facility is a company, but it is a government-owned company, so it's not really the traditional private sector. But of course, we needed to refer to certain contractors to provide the road transport, for example, and other things. So they have to play a role. But I think the whole process, due to its nature, was really government-driven. When it comes to other non-state actors, I think we already touched upon that they have an important role to play in the overall objective of the CWC.
I mean, I think your question is important because it actually highlights one of the original questions we had on deterrence, and also highlights the OPCW's role in sort of prevention of the lack of knowledge of a cache of chemical weapons somewhere, because the OPCW works with state parties to very actively maintain transparency, inspections, and sort of knowledge of any failures of the system, right? When any amount of chemicals go missing or any amount of chemicals are not accurately reported on, the OPCW is right there to work with the state parties to understand what happened. And I think, you know, the role of the private sector in one, just recognizing the importance of the whole chemical issue and the threat that non-state actors face going forward is something that the OPCW has really helped to work on, and all state parties to the EC help to push forward this knowledge. But I think with respect to deterrence, you know, the private sector and the government sector have to work together to make it very clear that, you know, the use of chemical weapons is unacceptable. And when we set up structures to deal with the use, such as the Joint Investigative Mechanism, we have to demonstrate consequences for the structures working the way we ask them to work. So the international community has set up, the OPCW, it has set up the Joint Investigative Mechanism to investigate incidents of use in Syria. The Joint Investigative Mechanism came forward and, you know, reported on confirmed attributable cases. I think the private sector is part of the international community that needs to now demand, as governments should as well, some consequences to maintain the deterrent value of the existing international legal framework. It's very important, and that's why these type of panels are important, to coordinate with the public on governmental activities and make sure that there is appreciation for the importance of these norms and laws. So I think the private sector has an important role to play in adhering and publishing and also demanding some type of consequence when laws are violated. And to adhere to that is to help with the entire deterrence narrative. So.
Excellent. I think we've got one more question here, and then another. What I'd like to do actually is I'll take a couple of questions, and we'll kind of answer those up as a group. Let's go right ahead.
Thank you. Jerry Epstein with the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I have a question for Ambassador Israng, which I think you partially answered, about the role within Germany of the various legal requirements that were necessary to actually, one can imagine a very complex orchestrated international operation coming down to a local official who isn't necessarily with the program, or with the citizens group, if German law permits, raising an issue in court that has to get managed. So I wonder if you could tell a little bit, given that you're a federal republic, how you've managed some of these issues that you said your Defense Department official did such a good job with.
Great. We'll hold that, and we'll get this question here.
I want to just anticipate that the situation in Iraq and Syria over the next 5 years, that we're going to discover unaccounted for weapons that were inadvertently lost or consciously hidden. Is there something from this experience that's going to help us deal with those rapidly and avoid what is alleged to have been in cases where forces in combat found discarded weapons and destroyed them on site, fearing they might get into the wrong hands, but maybe did not follow the procedures that ideally would be followed? How are we postured over the next 5 years to contend with that challenge?
Okay. Excellent. All right. Any other questions? I think okay, one more over here to Ali. Because that question is very much closely aligned to Paul's question and the topic that I raised.
Yeah, Olli Heinonen, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I have 3 specific questions which are actually related more to the terrorism and not what we have talked until now. The first question is actually the same as this gentleman from Rand Corporation. How sure we are that the Libyan declarations are not only accurate but complete? Because I have not seen any number assigned in the reports of OPCW. What is the certainty that everything has been declared? The second thing is to do with the terrorism, maybe more closely. What was done with the know-how? Design of facilities, design of the processes, documentation related to them, perhaps also to the people. Because if we go back, for example, to the dismantlement of South African chemical weapons program, some of the things got spread out after that. And then the third one, which I didn't hear, was what was done with the means of delivery? Or is this still something which is to be done? Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so I think we've got several very good questions there. I'm going to use that to kind of turn things back to our panelists to touch on those questions and offer your concluding thoughts. Clearly several tie together on the issue of what happens with regard to an emerging situation or where something was perhaps inadvertently, but is found to be present and we need to deal with it more rapidly. Those are very legitimate questions, as well as the domestic one. I think what I'll do is I will start down to the left, work my way down the panel, and we'll answer and comment on as many of those questions as possible and appropriate if it was directed to you. So Mallory, bring us home here.
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions, and I'm not sure I'm going to get to all of them, but there's a lot of us to answer. So one, with respect to this context of situations unforeseen, when you stumble upon something in a security concern environment and you feel the need to destroy it immediately. Luckily, that process was, not luckily, but intentionally that process was brought to the OPCW, and there was a note that was issued with respect to best practices going forward. So if that happens again, we have an OPCW-approved process to address it and provide for appropriate transparency and oversight, so there isn't any concern that the procedures may not be appropriately followed. And that's important because there needs to, again, be the international comfort level with the processes taken, recognizing, however, that the situations do pop up that are, novel and dangerous, and that there is an important effort to destroy the chemical weapons as soon as possible. So it's certainly a continuing concern, and it could still happen, but at least the OPCW community has voiced its opinion as to the best practices going forward to address that with sufficient transparency. I'm jumping around a little bit, and I apologize. With respect to the questions about the Libyan stockpile, my understanding is that Category 3 empty aerial bombs, the munitions themselves, were destroyed back in April 2004, and there was verification of that by the OPCW. There was continuing destruction of Category 1 and Category 2 CW from 2004 until this time. The oversight and knowledge of the OPCW about the Libyan stockpile is quite extensive, and so there's been a sufficiently high level of comfort that the information we've received from Libya over the course of the last 2 years has been extraordinarily accurate and tracks with what knowledge already existed. And I think that goes to the importance of the declarations being updated as new information is found, and the destruction process being completely transparent and verified. So maybe I'll leave some of the questions for other colleagues, so I know there's several others that haven't been answered, so to you.
Well, there are so many good questions that I would actually like to hear the answers to them as well, so I think I'll just pass it straight on to Simon, which I think has some of them.
I'll pick one to our RAND colleague. I appreciate the question. I would venture to say, not knowing the particular circumstance of which weapon and where in Iraq, for example, you mentioned Iraq, I believe that our relationship with the government of Iraq is so deep and so strong at this particular time that we would be in a position to rapidly intervene to secure and eliminate a weapon. I say this from personal experience, as does Rebecca and others, having worked with the Iraqis. We have active nonproliferation programs that today are providing personal protective equipment and chemical detection equipment to the Ministry of Interior, to the Ministry of Defense, and to the Kurds who are focused on the counter-ISIL fight. And we've been equipping parts of them, those that we can train in a very difficult environment and equip to deal with the threat posed by ISIL's use of chemical weapons, even low-grade chemical weapons. Back in April of this year, there was an interagency ministerial in Baghdad with their Minister of Defense, of Interior, and other related ministries, where they came together to focus on the chemical and potential biological threat that we attended and supported, and since then have been very engaged on helping the Iraqis confront this threat. So due to the strength of that engagement, I'm fairly confident in saying that we'd be able to intervene either indirectly by supporting the Iraqis or by providing some technical or assets or expertise.
I'm going to restrict myself to the question on the domestic setup in Germany. As you know, we are a federation. That means we have 16 federal states. 2 of them were involved in this operation. The city of Bremen, which is a federal state of its own with the port facilities, and the state of Lower Saxony, where the destruction site is located. And of course, we had to bring them on board, but not only them, but also some local authorities, for example, local environmental agencies that had to issue certain permits. Also, for the import license, we needed to have certain requirements like sample results. That's why it was so important to get those samples out of Libya and via Italy and Malta, and the sample results then from the OPCW lab and the lab in the UK. You're right, this is not a standard procedure. So in many cases, the first reaction is simply, no, we can't do that, or we can't do that in such a short period of time. And this required a lot of high-level talks. Our state secretary and the foreign ministry had to make several phone calls. There were several meetings up front with the involved agencies in Lower Saxony and Bremen to bring them on board. This is the official side, but then there's also the public side that you want to have the support by the local community, by the stakeholders. And that requires to get the right balance of transparency for local stakeholders on the one side and operational security on the other side. And this also included a learning process for us. And in the end, people were very busy over the summer to make these calls and these talks, and some of them had to cancel their vacations. So this was basically the trick to get this done.
So Ali, I'm not sure I understood your question about means of delivery. Can you restate it?
You meant the munitions, I believe, right? You meant the munitions as opposed to the bulk agent, correct?
Yes, everything. So what was in the purpose of the mission? Have you get a full complete declaration, and what is the certainty or which kind of assurances you can provide that this is a complete declaration and not just accurate, because these are two different things.
Right. So I think Mallory answered a large part of that, so I just want to make sure I understood what your question was. And then also, I think, as you know, that for these declarations, I mean, it's protected information amongst states parties, so the OPCW also doesn't publish unless states parties would like to make it public. And then, as I understand, the Libyans have modified their declaration and submitted it. So, I mean, I'll leave it at that. In terms of, actually, I feel like the rest of these questions were answered, so it's the benefit of being the last person. But the other thing I wanted to do is we've talked a lot about that there were these partner countries. Let me just give it to you, though, in one go so you can understand who these countries were. We obviously had the kind of core operational countries, which were Denmark for the transportation, Germany for destruction. We had the Canadians who provided these brand new containers. The U.S., which was able to provide some containers that were, I think, reused from the Syrian mission. The United States provided, if I have this correct, these GPS tracking devices, which is in Canada. Is that right? Oh, sorry. Oh, Canada did it. Sorry, apologies. And that's why Mallory said we knew exactly where these materials were all along the way. That's why. The United Kingdom provided both financial support and also their laboratory to do some of the sampling analysis. Finland, as we know, provided experts as well as a substantial financial contribution, in addition to Canada as well. Italy provided support for the Maritime mission in addition to the United Kingdom. We also had Malta, which helped facilitate the samples being flown out. And Italy, by the way, was actually helpful for this too. So there was one plan of how to get the samples out, and it didn't go through. So the Libyans actually had to meet the Italians in international waters, and there was also somebody from the technical secretariat who was there. And one piece of kind of our experience is, since that person was also trained in a NATO country, there's just like literally when we talk about interoperability, this is somebody who could just fit in with the Italians and how they do things. And I actually saw a video of the handover. And so as they're checking the sample packages, et cetera, and in the previous weeks, there had been some tension between the Libyans and the Italians, and yet they were able to just tamp down on that and say, no, this is like, these are good guys. We're all trying to do the right thing here. And actually, at the end of the handover, the Italians provided a final package to the Libyans, which I understand had some cake to celebrate. And so, I mean, talk about like important goodwill gestures. And then also France also provided support in Spain, and then there are several other countries who did things like overflight permissions. So, and of course, the United States, which not only provided substantial funding, but was also really core to unblocking some roadblocks that happened at times. And so again, I think this is like a perfect mixture of the technical secretariat's experience and expertise in planning something like this, and really working closely in partnership with states parties. So again, not without its challenges, but overall a success story. And to use, I guess, the German Ministry of Defense officers, desk officers sign off, it was, at the end, we will win. Yes, so, and I think that was prophetic and true. So, thank you.
All right, well, we're going to bring it to a close. I want to thank you all for participating, for the terrific panelists who engaged, and I think for, kind of giving us a chance to look at a different type of problem that actually brought together some different types of solutions. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time here. I think actually one of the overarching, most important lessons out of this experience is that you don't have to be perfect to have a successful regime that meets its obligations. The treaty system doesn't require that states parties prove negatives. That's impossible. They don't require perfect infallibility. They don't require those types. They require good faith, and they require active participation and support and consultation and collaboration to get to that positive outcome. They require good science when questions come up. They require good responses to verification and inspection measures, and all of those things build confidence. So I think when we see this, in many ways, it's the best possible lesson in terms of situations where things weren't perfectly declared the first time, but when they were found, they were declared and dealt with straightforwardly. When circumstances changed, the system responded to a change in circumstances. That suggests a regime that can be adaptable, that can take new challenges and try to figure out how to deal with them, and that can really turn around and say, at the end of the day, the biggest challenge we face is goodwill. And where there's goodwill, there's almost always an answer. And I hope that that is something that plays out when we look at these